Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to EVA, the first Academy of Engineering Sciences in the world. And we celebrated our first 100 years last year, so now we are 101 years old. So I'm really happy about this collaboration that we are launching today with the World Energy Council, because one of those things that EVA has always had on its agenda is different issues concerning the energy consumption, the energy production, and the energy supply. So this is 100 years of history for energy issues, and I'm really happy to be hosting this World Energy Council effort in Sweden from now on. I think that we as organizations have quite a lot in common. We both serve as bridge builders, and we both work for the greatest benefit for all people. And we also do both this by pulling together a community of very deep expertise, which are addressing both policy making and technology development. So, and also I think that looking around us, the world's biggest problems, we are doing this now in a time where technology development is probably more important than ever, and not the least in the issues of energy, which are going to be very fundamental for our ability to fight the climate change. So I'd like to welcome you without further words to this event, and I give the word for Johan Andersson, who is hosting the event for the World Energy Council. Please.
Thank you so much, Tula. And good afternoon and welcome to you all to today's webinar about the COVID-19 crisis impact on global energy use. My name is Johan Andersson and I'm the chair of the National Committee of the World Energy Council in Sweden. In my day job, though, I'm the chief executive of the Swedish Petroleum and Biofuels Institute. And today I'm really pleased for two main reasons. The first, as Tula mentioned, this webinar is the first activity in a joint collaboration between the World Energy Council and EVA, the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences. And two, we also have a number of really interesting speakers lined up to talk about the impact of a global health crisis on the energy sector and how we can move forward. So today we will hear from Mr. Carl-Henrik Svanberg, the chair of EVA, chair of Volvo and ex-chair of BP, Dr. Angela Wilkinson, the Secretary General and Chief Executive of the World Energy Council, Mr. Sebastian de Toro, who's the Secretary of State for Energy in Sweden, and Mrs. Elina Kinci, who's the co-founder of the energy analysis firm ELS Analysis. So when I woke up today, I could still switch on the lights in my house, I could still take a warm shower and have coffee and drive myself to the office. But we all know that the current COVID-19 crisis is having an impact on almost every part of our society. And we have seen major shifts in energy supply and demand, and the markets are in turmoil or have been in turmoil over the last few months. And the future is, to say the least, uncertain. But when the dust has settled and we're moving forward, how will those global energy markets have evolved from a business perspective? So I'm going to hand over to Mr. Carl-Henrik Svanberg to talk about that for a few minutes.
Thank you, Johan, and thanks for inviting me. It's a privilege to be among these great speakers. Let me start where everybody else have their minds right now on COVID-19. COVID-19 is, of course, affecting our societies in every way, and we have all those that suffer from the disease itself. We have those that suffer from being laid off or from seeing their companies, maybe since generations, not make it, basically go bankrupt. And I think one of the things that COVID-19 does with all the negative effects that comes from that, but there are also some I don't know if it's positive effects, but reasons to reflect on what kind of society we are living in. And I think it demonstrates that our societies actually, for many different reasons, are quite fragile and in several ways unsustainable. We see with so many people living in large cities today, we have problems with food distribution, food supply. We have problems with climate, of course, with the way we run our societies, and we have problems with health. So there are many reasons to think hard about what kind of society we will build. And it's one thing is clear, like you once said, there will be a day after COVID-19, but the new normal, as many of us talk about, will not be exactly where we left off. Some trends will have been pronounced, other trends may have been broken, and some remain. But one thing is also clear: COVID-19, I think, will be with us for quite some time. It will be with us for probably longer than we thought only a month or two ago. It'll take us probably a year before we get to a vaccine. The good news is that societies, one after the other, are starting to open up, but it will be step by step. And I'm sure there will be those that open up too fast, and you will have to sort of slow down again. And it will take quite some time before we have mass gatherings or rock concerts or so. In all of this, I think one thing that is clear is that this world needs more cooperation, not less. And this happens at a time when we are seeing different forces pull in different directions, with America becoming more self-centric and China has their strategy. So it's an important time also for Europe to stand up. If we should talk then about energy, which is the topic of the day, what COVID also does, it shows the beauty of less emissions. Those of you that have been in China over the last several years, you probably see that even on a day like with the weather like this today in Sweden, in Stockholm, you can hardly land an aeroplane without instruments. And suddenly the sky is opening up and we see the beauty of it. And I think we should learn from that and remember that. We can also, on the positive side, we can see that green energy is growing very quickly. If you look at all energy, forms of energy from oil, from coal to oil to gas to nuclear to hydro, no form of energy in the history of civilization has grown as fast as green does. That's the encouraging part. The less encouraging part is, of course, that it's not even close to the amount of energy needed. Energy is probably the biggest resource we have in the world, comparing to food. It's just huge, and we need lots of it. The good news again is that green energy is getting increasingly competitive, even if it's not there yet in the amount we need. But if you see the cost for producing solar energy or wind energy, the curves are just getting steeper and steeper, and we get to better and better places. That is great. And of course, when that happens, the volumes grow and we get more of it. What is more problematic, I think, is that the transition towards a greener world is in some ways a fragile one. I think we all know that this is a key priority for EU. It is a key priority for Sweden, and Sweden and EU, we don't mind to lead the world, but we cannot do it alone, because we will not get the amount of research development and the amount of energy and the economies of scale that it will require to get it to enough effective. We need also to understand that Europe, by 2050, we probably will see Europe's emissions be 3-4% of the world's total emissions. So we can easily conclude that even if we had zero emissions, we are a bit of a rounding error to the world. what really happens to the climate will be determined about how we are able to cope with getting green and emissions in Asia and in India and in Africa, in South America, where the huge part of the population is. And that doesn't take away our responsibility. We can't point at them. We find pride in creating a sustainable society in Europe. We take pride in taking the lead. We even think it tends to be a good business proposition. What is also a bit problematic during COVID is that when the going gets tough and you have to start to make tough priorities, some projects that are not necessary exactly today gets moved out, gets moved ahead. And this is of course happening to some extent with green projects, and that's just a fact of life. But short-term focus is pushing a lot of the climate change issues out. COVID-19 in the bigger scheme of things is not going to go on for a very long time, but it'll be with us for a year or so. If we should look at other forms of energy, if you look at oil and gas, we know that there is already, we are passing basically as we speak, at least one definition of peak oil, that is that there is more oil available than will ever be consumed. So we are past that point, and for that reason I think we should in principle assume that the oil price will always be not as high as we remember it has been from time to time, because there will be more of it. On the other hand, if you look historically for the last 30, 40 years, 50 years, you can see that the price spikes have not been about supply-demand. Well, it's been about supply, but it's been because of geopolitical disturbances, a civil war in Libya or a problem in Venezuela or whatever. So these can drive spikes, but generally oil prices are probably going to go lower, not as low as today, but they're going to stay somewhat low, which in a way doesn't help to drive and push forward the green transition. If you look at the oil prices, just to finish off with just one word, we have a funny pact today between Saudi and Russia. They are together in the need for increasing the oil price. So that pact, I think, we should assume will stay for at least a year or so. They have totally different views going forward, because Russia can adjust with their exchange rate of the ruble. They can adjust the oil price, but their lifting cost is probably north of $30. The Saudi lifting costs are maybe $10, but they need 70, 80 to feed the nation, because that's the way they've structured their society. So the pact doesn't look long-term sustainable, but shorter term, it will. And you see right now how the gap is closing between supply and demand. Supply is quickly falling, and if you look at various experts, you'll find the most optimistic would say you're going to close the gap before year end. Others say it takes a year from now. But then we will probably be back to something more normal in the 40-50 range or something. And that creates more stability for the oil market. But in the meantime, those that produce oil are suffering badly. Countries like Angola or Iraq or whatever, they are suffering badly from their lack of income to the state budget.
Thank you, Carl-Henrik. That was really interesting insights about the global perspective. Just one question, a quick one.
Yeah.
Do you see investment patterns in the industry shifting as a consequence of this COVID crisis?
Well, I think we should, when companies fight for their survival, they will go back to the drawing board and say, what actually do we need to move our company forward and secure its survival? Mm-hmm. Then I think we should assume that some projects gets pushed out. But I also think there are other reasons why. If I look at Volvo, for example, I see how we are not slowing down on the investment on research and development and stuff to to produce more sustainable ways of running our tracks. So I think it goes a little both ways, but I'm sure some will be pushed out.
Okay. Thank you very much, Carl-Henrik.
Thank you.
That's a really nice bridge into our next subject, where we're going to talk about surveys and tools being produced by the World Energy Council and how those can help us to make informed decisions. And Dr. Angela Wilkinson from the World Energy Council in London is going to give us a glimpse of some of the scenarios that the World Energy Council has produced and see evolving post the COVID-19 crisis. So over to you, Angela.
Thank you, Johan. Good morning, everybody. I think it's midday in Sweden, and I'm really sorry to miss out on the treat of a visit to Stockholm at this time of year. It's a beautiful location. I wish I was there. But greetings from a sunny Oxford anyway. I'd like to share with you some of the highlights of some of the recent surveys that we have been conducting globally around the impacts and actions taken in response to the COVID-19 crisis. And we have been using the information collected from those surveys also to start to develop a set of post-crisis scenarios to help people prepare and plan for what comes next. If I could please load up the slides. Thank you. And I'd also like just to congratulate our local colleagues in Sweden with their wonderful new partnership with IVA. I note we have a 101-year-old and a 97-year-old organisation moving into a new partnership. This is a brilliant an example of how persistence pays off, even as the COVID crisis presents dangers to the elderly population. There are some organisations in the world with persistence still. So, next slide, please. The World Energy Council has been around for 97 years, and we remain very much committed to an enduring mission of better energy for all. These days, we would refer to that as clean, affordable, and reliable energy. And it's interesting to transition from the last speaker who talked very much around renewables and oil and prices and technologies. We very much as the world's first and oldest global energy community movement are also very much interested in the cooperation around new global pathways for clean heat, clean power, clean fuels, and also what we would call flexible storage. And we remain very much a how-to energy community of practical wisdom. So we have, in the last couple of months, been conducting surveys across the world to share information across our membership about what are the impacts of the COVID crisis as it's unfolding in different countries. And today we sit at a time where we have over 5 million infections. We've had over 32,000 deaths, and the crisis has spread to over 200 countries across the world. So we've been collecting information from our members, and our members are 3,000 different organisations that represent the whole value chain of energy, everything from the producers to the service providers that represent all energy sectors. And our ambition is to recognise that there are many people who think we all know what needs to be done. Our challenge is to work out how to do it. We remain the how-to rather than the should-do community. And by sharing our know-how, we think that we can help facilitate better and well-managed and orderly global energy transition. So let's turn to some of the results. Let's turn to the surveys that we've been conducting. Our aims have been to take snapshots of information as the crisis has unfolded globally through a series of regular surveys. We ask our members about their experiences of the impacts and the actions that they're taking. We aim to inspire action to better prepare, rehearse and shape the future of the post-crisis energy situation. And we also seek to have impact by using what we are learning through crisis to inform and forge the new global energy leadership agenda. And to do that, we have been conducting We've completed a first round of survey in March and April. We currently have a second round of global surveys which are still open and live. And if you want to participate, we will gladly share the link. And we will open a third round of survey later on in the summer around July. The survey results are used also to develop these post-crisis scenarios. And when I use the word scenarios, I don't mean projections or forecasts, but plausible alternative futures that might emerge from the crisis situation, whether we would like them to or not. And to use these scenarios as a set of tools for helping energy leaders make decisions under unpredictable uncertainty. And we also seek to provide value-adding voice, the practical voice of what is really happening on the ground, what really are the lessons being learned, and what really are the different expectations and outlooks, and how do we engage with that diversity constructively. Next slide, please. So here's some of the highlights from the first round of surveys that were completed in March and April, which are drawn from responses in over 53 countries. As Johan said at the beginning, the lights are on, but the majority of energy firms have been affected already by the crisis. Most businesses report impacts, and the majority of the reported impacts are in terms of reduced productivity, the decrease in demand. Of course, we've seen demand declines in a drop of 10% overall in daily oil. We've seen over 20% reduction in electricity daily demand, and there are projections of 5 to 6% demand removal for the entire year. So we see a lot of decrease in demand responses. And we also see companies reporting cash flow issues. So although the lights are still on, the crisis is a real stress test of energy organisations, and particularly their financial resilience at this moment. We also see that post-crisis expectations, over half the respondents are reporting indicate that digital spillover effects and resilience capabilities are emerging as new agenda action items. And there are expectations of new operating models. So we are seeing expectations of accelerating digitalisation of the energy sector, of the need to increase resilience capabilities, and of the potential contraction of business. Next slide, please. Looking at the difference in regional perspectives, so we can look across different regions and ask what are there differences in experience or expectations. Here is an example of expectations of what will be the post-crisis recovery. And I'm sure everybody has been listening with interest to the debates about whether we will see this return to the pre-COVID normal, or whether there will be a new, a next, or a novel normal. In fact, there seem to be many different normals being discussed. Well, from within Europe perspective, the majority expect that once we pass peak crisis, we will see a return to normal within a 6 to 12 month period. But 15%, this was in March and April, expected that there wouldn't be a return to the pre-COVID business as usual, but a return to a new norm. Impacts aside, even before the crisis, many energy companies were starting to prepare for what they thought would be an economic recession. As we look at the impacts of the crisis and the implications for not just energy systems, but the stop in economic activity and the potential for recovery, we have started to identify a set of what we call post-crisis scenarios. Now, these scenarios take stock of what we're learning about what we know about COVID and what we know we don't know about COVID and the impacts of this crisis. And we find there are three different sets of critical uncertainty that make the future unpredictable. The first of these uncertainties is about the concept of return to the pre-pandemic normal, or some form of transformational transition and some next or new normal. The ambition and direction of action is a critical uncertainty. The second set of uncertainties are around this concept of collaboration that the first speaker highlighted is so necessary in a more interconnected world. Will we see a global collaborative approach, or will we see a diversity of approaches with an emphasis on greater self-reliance? And this uncertainty seems to to relate to the degree of trust in societies that will be strengthened or eroded as we experience the COVID crisis. And the third set of uncertainties is, of course, about the virus itself, its mutability and epidemiology and the effectiveness of our responses. And the uncertainty here is, even with the best efforts, whether we will see the swift development of a vaccine and an effective medical technology intervention, a technology fix, or whether we will see a more elusive virus and the requirement to rely less on technology fix and more on behavioural change to really ensure that we emerge from this crisis. And putting together these uncertainties, we have this simple 2x2 scenario matrix, with the x-axis reflecting really the differences in the trust and cooperation dimensions of the COVID experience, global cooperation, collaboration on the one hand, or greater diversity of approaches and self-reliance on the other. And on the vertical axis, this ambition of whether it is really recovering to the pre-COVID business as usual, or an aspiration to move somewhere very different, a transformational transition response. And this gives us our four different scenarios. A world of pause, in which we expect that there will be many different vaccine candidates, and the scaling up of manufacturing capacity but the scaling up of manufacturing capacity will be challenging, and countries will collaborate on medical technology fronts and best practices to contain the virus. This is pause. But that in energy terms, debt and uncertainty make it tough to finance new projects, which significantly slows down the transition to the new energy economy. On the other hand, we have also a story of rewind, a story where we see more diverse approaches and self-reliance, and this as we attempt to return to business as usual. And this is a story in which we would see US and the UK and China all developing promising vaccines, but vaccinating their own populations first. It's a world in which the energy sector faces growing protectionism as trade becomes more bilateral and global decoupling extends to energy transition as well. Or we might see a world of a future of re-record. This is a future in which we have more transformational ambitions, but we have more self-reliant and localized responses. This would be a future in which vaccines proliferate in a non-coordinated fashion and have different outcomes on a city-to-city level basis. In energy terms, we expect financial investment will begin to migrate from fossil fuels to what we might call a hybrid energy market, a mix of fossil fuels and renewables, but with diverse pathways to more circular economies and hybrid energy systems. Or we might also see this future called fast forward, a future in which we see much more effective scientific cooperation and collaboration, using big data, combining laboratory resources and rapidly scaling up the manufacturing of an effective global vaccine and its deployment, and a future in which that cooperation confidence inspires more cooperation and collaboration between scaling up the renewable power revolution. So emerging from the COVID crisis, we have currently these four different scenarios, which are not designed to be ways to predict what will happen, but are ways to help companies prepare, rehearse, and shape what will happen next by thinking about where are they putting their investments in enabling one of these scenarios or in blocking one of these scenarios from coming about. Next slide, please. The implications, the early implications we're starting to pull out from this survey work and this scenario work point to four new areas of discussion for the global energy transition leadership agenda. The first of these is around responsible leadership, and as people anticipate there will be increasing investment and acceleration of digitalization, we also have to address the positive and negative spillover effects of the Go Digital transition. A second implication is around the need to rethink resilience beyond the flow of electrons to include people, control centres and global value chains. The third is around the nature of rescue and recovery fiscal policies for averting, and their implications for averting not only a climate change crisis, but also a new energy shock. Our first speaker was very eloquent on the tightening that we could expect to return into the oil supply demand mix. And finally, the fourth R implication of the current surveys and scenarios that we're picking up is that we might see a bold redesign of energy markets. We are seeing much more radical policies in terms of social and behavioural change, and we might see new policy enablers, more policy innovation, which use the power of clean heat, clean power and clean fuels, combined with flexible storage pathways to achieve net zero emissions energy markets. So here's some highlights of our surveys, a sample of our scenarios, and some of the emerging implications as we see them. Next slide, please. So let me end. Of course, this isn't the end of the survey. The crisis is still unfolding. We still expect the worst to come for the energy sector. Even in the challenge is not just the implications now, but also the unfolding fiscal and climate challenges as we move into the future. Our work is still going on. We are open, a community which is open to all. If you would like to participate in these surveys, we would welcome your input. We will also be releasing a scenario tracking system soon, looking at signals of the different scenarios that are unfolding, and you would be welcome to participate as part of that. And we will also be running a series of scenario-based summits with different communities across the next year. So for us, the story is still being written. We welcome people contributing to our community. We believe that this is a community, global community interest project, and that this is not the time to start competing around the future. This is the time to move our collaboration, not just in terms of sharing what's going on now, but anticipating how we can still continue to shape a better energy future for all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Angela. That was a lot of really thought-provoking insights in there, and we will definitely come back with more information later. I'm going to check if the technology allows me to ask one quick question of you, Angela. The question is, in all of your conversations with the energy community around the world, there must have been lots of data coming back, but also lots of interesting stories. Is there one story that you would like to share that you've heard when you gathered this data?
There are some incredibly interesting developments happening, and I'd like to give a good news story and a bad news story at the same time, just to show that the impact of the COVID crisis is actually incredibly uneven in terms across the world. From Colombia, the stress on society around the cost of energy has led the government to initiate what they call a Share My Energy scheme, which allows people to pay the energy household bills for those who can't afford it as we move through this crisis. I think that's a remarkable story of capital reallocation and of families helping each other out in crisis. On the other side of the world, when we engage with our African member communities, they are struggling in this crisis, which has also revealed digital divides, even as we accelerate digitalization within the energy sector. Some of them are managing their energy systems from their mobile phones because that is the capability that is actually open to them in Africa. So we're seeing these different stories of hope and also distress emerging quickly as we conduct these surveys across the world.
Thank you so much, Angela. That was adding further flavor to all of the data we've been looking at. And we will definitely come back to you with more insights and reports throughout the year to help us all understand the energy world a little bit better. We're now going to move to a Swedish perspective, and we're really happy to have Sebastian de Toro with us to talk about the role of government and politics in the future of energy transition. So over to you, Mr. de Toro.
Thank you very much. First, just a sound check. Do you hear me? Yes, perfect. Well, thank you very much for being able to participate at this meeting. I'm State Secretary in the Swedish government for energy and digital development. And I'm first going to make a short reflection about the digital side of my portfolio before I go into energy. Because despite all the tragedies that we are witnessing around the world and in our societies due to COVID-19, this crisis also brings about changes that can be beneficial for us. And for example, having a webinar using video conferences much more than we did before, I think is a small step forward for our digital development in our societies. In my role as State Secretary for Digital Development, I have often asked myself why economic growth in many leading economies, for example in Sweden and in the US, has been slower during the ICT era than during the late industrial or post-industrial era. In Sweden and the US, the GDP growth per capita, the real GDP growth per capita, has been 0.7 percentage point lower each year during the ICT era than before. And I think that the major reason for this is that the prevalence of technology is not enough to create economic growth or societal change. In order to reach its benefits, technology must also be used in our society. People must accept it, business models must change, there need to be institutions that make it possible to organize societies in new ways, and people and businesses need competence in order to reap the benefits of the new technology, and there needs also to be an infrastructure built around it. And COVID-19 and all the restrictions on traveling, going outdoors, and other restrictions, as well as the behavioral change that we as human beings are doing by ourselves, can really force this digital development to happen. However, it's not only about the digitalization, of course, and I think these two areas are quite interconnected, digitalization and energy. So I think it's a way of just introducing the subject and how this pandemic crisis is also affecting other markets in our society. I was really intrigued by your question. How will the crisis affect global energy markets? It's something that we have been discussing here at the Ministry in Sweden and also with other colleagues when I meet them. And I'm a little bit afraid now that I have to give you a negative spoiler alert, at least if you expected me to give you the final answer, because I don't have it. But I hope that this discussion today will give us some more clues of what might happen in the future. And I think that the previous speakers have already given us some very interesting insights. I think that in order to analyze what will happen after the crisis, first of all, we have to think about what was happening before the crisis, if we would still live in a world of business as usual. Would continuous economic growth all over the world lead to higher energy demand of any sort, just to get the impact that factories and businesses and households were craving for? Or would the efforts to cut down on CO2 emissions and new relative prices between green and other energy lead to a higher proportion for renewables in the energy mix? And also, would continuous efforts to be more efficient, energy efficient, finally stop the link between economic growth and energy consumption? I think that growing insight among policymakers and among humans as a whole have already made conditions for renewables more favorable than it was before, but not to the extent that we need in order to curb CO2 emissions enough to stop global heating. The use of fossil-based energy is not only high still, but also growing in some parts of the world, and this needs to change. Now we are living in a world that has been hit by an economic shock, which short-term effects is almost unheard of. I think we have to go back to World War II, or perhaps even to the economic depressions, to find some kind of similar effects to our economies. The problem is that we don't know which long-term effect this will have still. I don't know if you remember the famous answer by Zhou Enlai, a high politician in the Communist Party in China, when he was asked about his thoughts about the French Revolution, and he said it's too early to evaluate. This was about 200 years after the French Revolution. So if we are now sitting here and trying to really know what will happen in the economy and society as a whole, and in the energy market to be more specific, I think it's too early. I think we much more have to think about different scenarios and different possibilities. And I think that Angela Wilkinson put this out nice when she said that there is a lot of uncertainties and different ways that this can happen. One major factor to analyze the future is, of course, to trying to understand how long this shock will be. I guess that if this goes over quickly, and I'm now talking about the medicine perspective of this, then some of the changes we're seeing, perhaps of having video conferences and traveling less, will last, but a lot of the other things will go back to normal. But as the longer time that this crisis goes on, the more impact it will have in all kinds and all ways of our societies, both directly to the energy sector and also indirectly affecting the energy sector in the long run. What we have seen so far is a major price collapse in a lot of markets. And that is not only due to COVID-19, of course, also other factors, as for example the mild winter in the northern hemisphere, and the price war on oil between Russia and Saudi Arabia has also affected this development. There have been cuts in production in order to handle and face this new economic situation, but the cuts have not been large enough in order to curb the price effect. And of course, it's not only about the supply side here that is important, but especially in the long run, the demand side and the effect that the restrictions and the economic downturn will have in our societies will affect energy markets. In the short term, I understand that renewables have fared better than other energy sources, primarily due to the fact that marginal production of other energy has been abolished when prices have gone down. And as I said before, at the same time, demand for oil due to less transportation and coal due to less heating and industrial production has gone down. But coming back to the question about how long this will prevail, when and if the economy starts growing again. And I have a couple of questions that I don't know the exact answer of, but I think that we have to think through. How will current price reduction in fossil fuels affect demand and investments in the long run? On the one hand, that should lead investors to invest more in other sources where you can get a better payoff for your investments. On the other hand, there is a lot of insecurity at this moment, and you don't know if you really want to make these investments when you don't know where the future is going, and then you would get stuck into your current production structures instead. Another question is, how long will these travel restrictions prevail, and how long will we as human beings travel less because we're afraid of what can happen if we go abroad? Another question is, will a second wave of COVID-19 in countries that are dependent on coal, like China and Africa, lead to more persistence in the price development? But I think that the main question actually is another one, and that is, how will policymakers all over the world be affected by this change? Is the way to stimulate the economy to go back to higher employment and lower unemployment and growth again? Is that to just rescue the old structures, or is it to pursue new green policies and also being able to reach our climate goals? That will be one of the major questions in the future. It is said that it was Churchill that first quoted the phrase, "Never waste a good crisis." I don't know if it was really him, might be an urban legend, but the phrase itself is important, and it lies in the interest of every one of us who believes that we need to pursue more green policies, that we need to curb CO2 emissions, that we need to fight global heating, to really use this crisis to pursue those kind of policies. And this is the aim of the Swedish government. This is what we are trying to do in the future. But even though Sweden and small countries in general can, to some extent, lead by example, it is not enough. We stand for 0.2% of the global CO2 emissions. If this crisis should be used in order to promote green transition, major countries, major economies must also take a step forward. Here the European Union's Green Deal is an important step, but I really do hope that other major economies in the world will also go in the same direction. And that is something that we will try to promote in our international relationship with other countries. I also hope that if we're able to do this, if we're able to really set a goal forward, that will also help investors and reduce the insecurity they face, so that they know which kind of production systems they should invest into. But of course, this responsibility lies for politicians everywhere, and we need to be lots of people working in the same direction. Not only politicians, but also businessmen and scientists and everyone else that can influence people to work in that direction. Well, with that, I would like to end my remark. I think we are slightly behind schedule, so I'm so happy to be able to be here and also to listen to the previous speakers and what is next to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. That was really insightful and a really good view on, especially around the policymakers' big questions to take into account when we're now starting to reopen the economy and start building the economy again. And I think you answered my question during your remarks, so I don't have a question for you right now. So that's really brilliant. Thank you. We're now going to go to our last speaker, Elin Akinci from ELS Analysis. And I guess the last 2-3 months have been really hectic for a company who's focusing on analysis of the energy markets with everything going on. But is this now the new normal, or are we going to go back to business as usual? So over to you, Elin.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to join this discussion. So I hope I will be able to say something new now and just not repeat what everyone else has said previously. But I thought I focus on two main drivers for the energy industry and the energy market. So it's obviously market developments and climate policies. So I'll try to give you our view on how we see it, but also how we sort of follow these trends and what we focus on to give you a sense of how we build our analysis. So looking at market developments, I think someone mentioned that earlier, but I would really like to stress first that COVID-19 has really been exposing and accelerating already existing weaknesses in markets, in almost all energy markets. As we all know, the global oil market has been struggling with this for a while, with oversupply pushing prices down and OPEC Plus managing the market by cutting supply. The same goes for global LNG and European gas markets. We've been seeing prices decreasing quite significantly during 2019. And a similar story goes for the Nordic power market, even though for different reasons. So the only market that really saw a recovery during 2019 was the European carbon market. And that was very much due to the fact that a market stability reserve was introduced in order to make the market more effective in the fuel switch after losing that sort of function during the last financial crisis. So COVID-19 has really sort of severely hit demand and pushed markets down even further from an already weak position. And everyone is focusing very much now on low prices and price levels, and rightly so. I mean, we have never, or it's historically low prices that are shaping markets at the moment. But I would like to shift focus a bit and just stress that it's important also to look at the volatility in the market, but also differentials between spot markets and futures markets, because that is telling us more of a story of sentiment in the market, but also how markets are likely to move ahead going forward. So what are these volatility rates and differentials telling us? Well, first of all, they are telling us that markets are very much driven by uncertainties. They're driven by lack of long-term strategies. And they are also telling us that these weak prices that we are seeing at the moment will likely end up in significantly higher prices in the medium term, because lack of investments into new production and export capacities happening at the moment now in this very low price environment will impact prices in the medium term and could also give us a situation where there's some shortage in supply. So I think the new normal for markets, just going to give you a quick conclusion, is that we are heading towards much more boom and bust market conditions rather than this stable sort of the price bands that we saw years ago. But looking at this outlook, so what could actually change them? Well, the economical recovery will play a key role, obviously. Unfortunately, we are seen to be heading towards more of a U-turn and shaped recovery rather than a shaped recovery. And that is very much because 2 months ago, everyone was very optimistic about Q4, that we were going to see an uptick in the economy. But as we are moving closer to that quarter, we can see that that was a bit too optimistic. So this is sending a rather negative signal to markets, but also, to the rest of society in general. The second thing that will drive market developments is government responses and policy making. This is where, coming into my second focus, climate policy. So I will focus very much on Europe and on the EU level, but this year seems to be a very hectic year for the EU, not only because they will have to deal with this pandemic and sort of find a joint crisis management, but also because they have a lot on their plate in order to agree on new climate issues, such as a new climate law, which is centered very much around revised climate targets for 2030 and 2050. So the EU Commission gained support, almost full support from member states for their 2050 climate target earlier this year. but the 2030 target is still up for negotiations. And I would like to make a point here that this is where we are seeing as the most uncertain factor to all of this. Agreeing on 2030 climate target will be much more difficult than gaining support for the 2050 target. Both in terms of agreeing on the reduction level, but also how to sort of achieve these climate targets. So this is from the policy side sending quite uncertain signals, I would say. The EU Commission has, however, stressed strongly, together with a lot of member states, that the pandemic, this current crisis, will not affect the EU's climate ambitions, and that work just will go hand in hand, and we will see a sort of green recovery. And here I would just like to say two things. So, which was mentioned also earlier, I do believe that these lockdowns have really taught us that changing behaviours can really lead to us being a part, as people being a part of this green transition. And changing behaviours is key in order to succeed these green transitions. So I'm slightly positive there that this will really speed up that part of the transition. I'm more cautious, optimistic about member states being able to succeed in many of the forthcoming negotiations on the EU level, not in terms of budgets, which will be key in order to succeed with this energy transition. Because agreeing on a long-term budget will be the way to finance the green transition. But even now we are seeing quite a significant split between certain member states on even the recovery budget, where Sweden also have taken the stand and not agreeing on the structure that was proposed earlier this week. So these sort of differences between member states on key issues we expect actually to remain. With that said, it doesn't mean that there will not be any compromises or laws will not be implemented or regulations. It will happen eventually, but we do believe that there will be a significant delay in these processes going forward. So what kind of signals are this sending to the energy community? Well, I think to a much larger extent we are seeing that energy companies and market actors are relying much more on policy directions. So what the industry is really asking for is long-term perspectives and roadmaps for how they later on will invest in their long-term strategies, but also which road they should take in the decarbonisation process. So this is rather, how to say, there's a risk that we are seeing that the industry and the market are facing some policy uncertainties. So just quickly conclude. I would say that the new normal will be obviously driven very much by uncertainties. I think policy will play a much bigger role going forward for markets and the market actors. And we do not believe in any way that the green transition has lost momentum, but we do see some significant delays in important process. And we also think that there will be a rather bumpy road to get to these more common long-term strategies. So I think I end there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Elin, for your insights. We are running out of time, so sorry, but I won't have time to ask any questions, even though I had many. But I'm going to try to summarize in 1 minute. So if you all bear with me for another minute. So it's difficult to summarize everything that's been said today, but I put down a few bullet points. First one is we don't really know what's going to happen. The other one is that the crisis has shown that society is fragile and not sustainable, and that a new normal is expected to emerge post the crisis. This crisis may also be the break in the link between economic growth and energy use, so efficiency measures will be really important for the future. And we also see that low investment in the energy sector now may actually mean higher energy prices mid-term. So those were just a few takeouts, but I will definitely come back with more later on. So this concludes today's webinar, and we hope that you have enjoyed listening. And a big thank you to all of the speakers in today's webinar. And we hope that the insights will be useful in your conversations about the energy markets post-COVID-19. We will come back throughout the year with more reports and updates on the surveys done by the World Energy Council. And we look forward to engage with you all. Until then, there is lots of material available on the website, www.worldenergy.org. And thank you all and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.